Well, hello, brothers and sisters. This is Mikhail here again. Today, I'm going to talk about a new book that has been published with respect to the situation in the Sasquatch and all of it. It's a very interesting book. Here it is. It's called Corona False Alarm. Apparently, it was published first in Germany by German researchers back in June, summarizing the situation in that country as well as elsewhere in the world, going back to March, April, May, and partly June. It immediately became a bestseller, and there was so much demand for it that eventually was translated into English, and now it's available since October 2nd to English-speaking audience. So, highly recommended. I really enjoyed it. I got it only a few days ago, couldn't stop reading it overnight, read it all, highlighted pretty much on every page. The book is very nicely referenced. It has 246 references. So all the information in the book is not just a collection of bare claims and opinions. It's all cited and supported by different facts and different papers, references to news media, other resources, etc., etc. Now, the book itself is available on Amazon. You can get it on Kindle for about $2. But I prefer the hard copy because it's always harder to destroy, especially in the age of these modern Nazis that try to remove digital information anytime on their whim. Now, what is interesting about this book, it is written by two PhD researchers from Germany. And as you can see here, Dr. Karina Reiss, she has studied biology at the University of Kiel. She received her PhD back in 2001, and she is associate assistant professor and associate professor at the University of Kiel. She published over 60 articles in the fields of cell biology, biochemistry, inflammation, and infection. Okay, now also Dr. Sucharit Bhakdi, who was born in Washington, D.C., is a leading authority over many decades in a variety of different fields. So he published over 300 articles in the fields of immunology, bacteriology, virology, and parasitology, for which he has received numerous awards, etc., etc. So as you can see, these are not just some news commentators or bureaucrats from the World Health Organization or anything like that. These are people with solid credentials, honest researchers. They looked at the situation. They have expertise in their particular field. So this is not just scientists from unrelated fields who are making comments on the particular subject matter. No, they actually specialize in infectious diseases and they know what they're talking about. So that's why this book is so valuable, because it provides invaluable information, the very, very rich information as an independent confirmation on all the things that we talked about. So without further ado, let me jump into this book, because I know not many of you have time and opportunity to read it all, so I'll just do some of the important highlights, okay? So let me first start by going through some of the pages here, and the authors start by introducing some core information on the coronaviruses. And in particular, they say that, first of all, coronaviruses are widespread. The normal coronaviruses are responsible for 10 to 20% of respiratory infections, and they generate symptoms of a common cold. Okay, so there's a lot of people are saying, look, COVID-19 is nothing basically but some kind of weaponized version of common cold. Severe illness occurs mainly in the elderly and can take a fatal course, particularly in patients with pre-existing illnesses, especially of heart and lung. Thus, even harmless coronaviruses can be associated with case fatality rates of 8% or more when they gain entry into the nursing homes. As you'll see, this particular characteristic of coronaviruses will become extremely instrumental in understanding some of the phenomena that not only they observed in Germany, but also took place here in the United States and elsewhere in the world, the crimes against humanity and human dignity committed in so many places. So then they basically describe what happened, like how this whole pandemic started, etc., etc. And of course, the big question number one that they're trying to address is, how serious is it? And what they demonstrate, and you pardon all of my highlightings and everything. This is sometimes when I read the books, I'll highlight things, put my marks, etc., etc. But you can get it for your own, and you can also see the same thing, reach a similar set of conclusions. But they basically say the truth surrounding the virus remained enshrouded in a tangle of rumors, myths, and beliefs. And I guess this is the whole book. This is what it's all about. It turns out that the actual case fatality rate is around 0.2%, and it's been admitted by all the core organizations out there. And the COVID-19 is comparable to seasonal flu. Just to put things into perspective, if you look at this little table, the histogram of the number of deaths in Germany per 10,000 people aged 80 years and more, the total number of deaths this year is about 1,200 per 10,000. The coronary vascular disease is a major chunk, followed by cancer, followed by respiratory infections, followed by COVID-19. Now, as you can see, this is insignificant, and that's based on the results back on the data back in June for Germany. And Germany kept a pretty good track record of describing and recording everything that happened. So as you can see, this alone should already debunk all this talk about this enormous killer Sasquatch out there threatening each and every one of us. And again, these are for people 80 years or older, okay? Very important. The next interesting insight, they point out the situation that took place in the Diamond Princess. Remember that cruise ship that was stuck up here and near around LA? There's some people who called it a plague ship because that was the ship that was isolated and for several weeks in a severe quarantine. Most of the people were elderly. And look, here's what the findings are. The case fatality rate on that ship ended up being about 1%. But this was largely an elderly population in which the death rate from COVID-19 is much higher. Okay, so here's an interesting thing about the Diamond Princess. This is what we call a real-life experiment. This is something that normally ethics would not allow us to do. But we had a group of people in the risk group isolated and basically infecting each other. The end result of it, the overall case fatality rate is about 1%, which is in agreement with all these other numbers and measures that we already looked at. So again, COVID-19 is comparable to seasonal flu. End of story. There's therefore no justifications for lockdowns and all this other exaggerated garbage that we've heard over the ensuing weeks, months, etc. Okay, so let me move on. The next big question is that the authors address is this so-called asymptomatic individuals. And look what they write in the book. And again, it's all heavily referenced, so you can check the references, you can look into the papers, etc., etc. So basically say perhaps asymptomatic people are contagious and unknowingly pass the virus onto others. This fear originated from a publication co-authored and widely publicized by Drosten. That's basically some of the health authorities in Germany. And look what it actually the authors point out. In the midst of general panic, a very important fact escaped general attention. The major statement of the publication turned out to be false. In fact, no studies exist to indicate that children play any significant role as vectors of transmission for this disease. So to summarize all of this, it basically means that A, the paper that claimed that there was an asymptomatic individual, a Chinese woman that infected, presumably in an asymptomatic way, someone in the United States. It turns out that Chinese woman had been ill during her stay in Germany. Was under medication to relieve pain and reduce fever. This was not mentioned in the original publication. Again, they're talking about Germany, but there's a lot of similar things happened elsewhere in the world. And the number two, there is no studies that exist to indicate that children play any significant role as vectors of transmission. And yet we're masking all of our schools, we're robbing children of all of the social communications, we're robbing them of graduations, we're robbing them of classes, etc., 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 right? So again, the overall summary here, asymptomatic spreaders is a myth. It's a Sasquatch. It's an invisible threat that never really took place, and children play no role in the transmission. I cannot kid you more about this particular situation and how annoying this particular aspect of this entire pandemic can be. This invisible threat that vilifies all of the people, and some people in the stores are looking at me as the personal enemy, as if I can somehow spread this invisible monster onto them, even though I'm perfectly healthy and experience no symptoms whatsoever. Okay, so that brings me to 2 Thessalonians 2:11. Therefore God sends them a strong delusion so that they may believe what is false. Okay, now here's what I find fascinating. I'll be throwing in a few biblical verses here and there, because you can see how the whole new picture emerges as we keep pushing through this little deck of slides, and as I keep going through the book. The next important subject matter is, okay, but what about hot spots? What about all these places in New York, Italy, and elsewhere, right? Because we've all seen and heard all these stories in the news, especially back in March, April, and even in May, right? So here's what the authors are saying here, just a little selection of citations here. There was a well-founded concern that the lockdown may have unintentional but serious consequences for the public health. It became increasingly clear that people avoided hospitals and even faced with life-threatening events such as heart attacks because they were afraid of catching the deadly virus. So in other words, some people actually got sicker and some even died just because they were so afraid to go to the hospitals to get the first aid. Then it says, for example, when the influenza epidemic swept over the world in the winter of 2017-2018, hospitals in the U.S. were overwhelmed. In other words, when the news were showing all these overwhelmed hospitals, etc., this is not something that we have never seen before. It actually happens over and over and over again. Then they also point out that the Italian society is one of the oldest worldwide, and Italy has the highest proportion of over 65 years old. So it's almost basically 23% in the European Union. And they also have a large number of people with chronic lung and heart disease, and have a much greater number of the high-risk groups as compared to other countries. Okay? Now, there's been another set of suspicions, and this I want to point your attention specifically to this one, that suspicions have been voiced that the vaccination against various pathogens such as flu and all these other diseases can worsen the course of COVID-19, and investigations into this possibility are called for because Italy indeed stands out with its officially imposed extensive vaccination program for the entire population. Brothers and sisters, it happened before. It happens during the Spanish flu pandemic from 100 years ago, when the second wave was actually triggered by extensive vaccination campaigns against typhoid disease and other types of diseases out there. And there's a lot of suspicion that this is what may have happened in some of these so-called hotspots. Of course, the further investigation is needed, but the very fact that these accusations there as a possibility is already enough merit to keep looking into these issues. Now, going back to New York, again, what is interesting that New York, according to all of the data, apparently got hit, I kid you not, 500 times stronger than any other place in the world. Now, that doesn't make much sense because viruses do not have a selective intelligence. And when you look at all these other places, like, for example, in the European Union, you look at the Brussels and Belgium, or when you look at the UK, or when you look at some of these other countries that are followers of the EU policies, all of a sudden you discover that they were hit 100 times, 200 times stronger, or when all of a sudden all of the rules of epidemiology were violated and the virus decided to go sideways, as if the virus had intelligence enough to maintain the spread, and just when everything is over it would continue on and on and on and on. Now, but you see, viruses are just mindless biological machines. They do not have this selective intelligence that's attributed to them. And again, you see lots of alternative reasons that can explain all these excess deaths. So in other words, when you see an anomalies like what you saw in Italy, like what you saw in New York and Brussels in the UK, and some of these so-called hot spots, they do not fit the profile of the viral behavior. There's something else is going on. Call it factor X, call it the agenda, call it problems in reporting, call it whatever you call it, but it all demands a very important and powerful investigation, and this is what this book alerts you to. Now, the next important subject is the issue of treatments. And again, the authors clearly demonstrate some of the pretty disturbing facts about the treatments that were employed in this particular scenario. So, for example, on page 67, they say that the artificially ventilated patients require very close attention. Because oxygen is forced through a tube into the lungs, it is not uncommon for bacteria to hitch a ride and then cause life-threatening pneumonia. So there you go. Prolonged use of a ventilator can actually cause pneumonia, right? And not necessarily the original virus. So you get someone who has some type of symptoms, and then they put on the ventilator, and the end result of the journey is the pneumonia that was caused by the treatment and not necessarily the original disease. And I say, in contrast, COVID-19 patients were often put on ventilation early and without true need, and kept on the apparatus for longer than they ever should have been. Why? And notice they say why, because it was officially stipulated that this technique was the best means to reduce the risk of virus spread by aerosol to the personnel. However, that was not likely to be the case to begin with. So in other words, the medical workers were so paranoid and so afraid that they were actually embracing these protocols to shove the tube down the patient's throat, to lock them up. And even though they could die of all of that invasive treatment, they were having this false hope that this way it will stop the infection from spreading to others. Again, it's all based on false science. And you know, I cannot but recall Isaiah 29:15 in this particular scenario. Ah, you who hide deep from the Lord, you counsel, whose deeds are in the dark, and who say, who sees us, who knows us? You know how many people died alone in those hospital rooms with the ventilators down their throat and all the tubing and everything, surrounded by masked people, surrounded by all of that coldness and fear and paranoia, and not being able to say goodbye to the relatives, not being able to see a friendly face, to being able to go onto the rest of their journey, the ending of their life's journey, with human dignity. See, this is the kind of stuff that makes me very, very disturbed internally, because I know how much crime and injustice has been committed in all of those places. Now, the next part of the book exhibits all of these misleading statistics that were employed to propagate more panic, more fear, and more paranoia. This is just a few examples here that's on page 40 something. Now, if you report number of people tested positive, and these are different weeks, week number 10, 11, 12, 13. So that's at the peak of the pandemic back in March and April. Notice how these bars, the number of people tested positive, they create an impression of this severe increasing pandemic that is like encroaching upon us, and it's the end of the world, exponential growth, etc., etc. But here's what happens when you look at the number of people tested positive per 100,000 tests. Do you see the same picture? No, right? You can clearly see that things are somewhat slowing down, and it's far from having that exponential growth. There's another technique that we use, number of people tested positive, the total sum. Remember these famous curves? I remember back in March, even I was fooled because I was looking at all these curves by LA Times and all these other John Hopkins, all these reporting agencies, and they were showing, oh, look at the curve, it goes up and up and up and up. But here's what happens when you actually look at the corrected numbers, when you remove the people who actually recovered and became healthy. See how the curve reverses its move? See, this is the kind of misleading stats that have been employed over and over and over again, as Mark Twain once said, right? There is a lies, damn lies, and there is a statistics. As a statistician, I feel very ashamed of my profession because I see that these are all these misleading factors that were used and the techniques that were used to propagate all of these lies and deception. Now, Neil Ferguson of the Imperial College in London is notoriously known for all of these falsifications. He's the one who predicted 136,000 deaths due to mad cow disease, BSE, and 200 million deaths due to avian flu, and the 65,000 deaths due to, I believe it was a swine flu. You can read it in the book. But that prediction was so grossly overestimated when they actually looked at the number of people who died of those diseases, and it actually counts into only a few hundred. See, this is the kind of propaganda and paranoia that is being employed, and yet people forget about it. They keep trusting all these news and all these lies that are being told. And that reminds me of Proverbs 10:9. Whoever works in integrity walks securely, but he who makes his ways crooked will be found out. And I can tell you, all of you, the Neil Fergusons and all these other reporters and all these statisticians out there and all of the data collectors, your ways are crooked. You will be found out. That's why it's such a massive scam that's being basically exposed by these authors, and as well as all these other authors out there who are seriously looking at the data. Here is another big problem, the impact of lockdown. Now, I talked about it for quite some time, and here in the United States, when we look at some data, there was a guy from UK that looked at the situation in the UK. Here is a situation from Germany. And again, what these authors are clearly demonstrating based on the analysis of all of the data, they basically say that the epidemic had reached its peak at the beginning to the middle of March, well before the lockdown at the end of March. And the lockdown had no effect, nada, ninch. Numbers dropped no further after its implementation. If this is the profile of basically what you have, this is the reproduction number, which is something related to how quickly it spreads out. As you can see, it already dropped down, and when the lockdown was instituted, it actually stayed flat. There was no impact whatsoever of this thing dropping down anywhere further. Same thing here. A number of people tested positive. Notice that's when they introduced mandatory face masks and with all these lockdowns and everything. It was over by then. The people who were most vulnerable were already impacted, and some of them died. But then we went into the lockdown, and it seems to be the same story over and over and over again. Now, what is interesting, though, is that the impact of the lockdown can actually be, again, tested indirectly using solid statistical and scientific means. Thank goodness there's quite a few countries out there, a handful, but still they provide a very representative sample. Countries such as Sweden, Iceland, Hong Kong, South Korea, Japan, all of these examples have confirmed what recognized experts have said all along. Lockdowns are not necessary. They cause massive social and economic damage. They cannot justify any possible benefits, but were the benefits at all? Now look at this little chart down here. Look, these are basically the number of deaths per 1 million population. Again, we have to always normalize things, otherwise you cannot even begin at the true picture. And notice there is Sweden right here, this bar over here. This one here is Belgium, the heart of the European Union, right? Almost twice as high. Here you have Italy, here you have United Kingdom, here you have Poland, here you have Spain, right? On the other hand, here you have South Korea, Hong Kong, Japan, places that have higher population density than any of these European countries or New York City, as a matter of fact. And what do we see? Those places don't have any lockdowns whatsoever. They're not even sticking out. They are further down. So the bottom line, lockdown was late, unnecessary, and ineffective. And that reminds me of Proverbs 14:15. The simple believes everything, but the prudent gives thought to his steps. And I can tell you, our governments did not give any thought to their steps. Because if they were thinking, that would have never happened, because this is literally right into your face, and all the data was already available to all of them back at that point. Okay, so in the next part, what about masks? I've been saying about masks for months. In fact, I've started all of this YouTubing activity on a regular basis back in May, when I got so annoyed with all of these unscientific mandates and all the other garbage that was propagated on us. And look what these authors yet again, once again, summarize. Mandatory masks. There is simply a lack of clear evidence that people who are not ill or not providing care should wear a mask to reduce influenza or COVID-19 transmission. End of story. No evidence whatsoever. Notice, no scientific evidence that symptom-free people without cough or fever spread the disease. No, nothing. Simple masks do not and cannot stop the virus. Masks do not and cannot protect from infection. Non-medical face masks have very low filter efficiency. Look at all these references. Cotton surgical masks can be associated with a higher risk of penetration of microorganisms. Because of moisture retention, reuse of cloth, and poor filtration may result in increased risk of infection, okay? So widespread recommendations are based on wishful thinking, a faulty intuition. I'm sick and tired of seeing all of these Google images and other so-called experts showing all these air droplets and cartoons and all of this other stuff that may look somewhat convincing on the surface, but there's no scientific justification for it whatsoever. What the science really teaching us is that masks are ineffective and they can hurt you, okay? Ineffective and can hurt you. And if you don't believe these authors, if you don't believe me, if you don't believe all the other publications that I've cited over all these weeks, then there is another source that I found out recently on Del Big Tree on his channel. He had a very nice interview with two ladies from OSHA. I think it's Occupation Safety and Health Agency. This is the #1 agency in the United States that deals with masks, deals with respirators, deals with protective, personal protective equipment, the PPEs, etc., etc. They're the ones certifying hospitals. They're the ones doing all of these, that they're really experts in that field. And here's what they had to say, and I find it extremely instructive. Just listen to this.
Right? Yeah. All of a sudden now everybody flip-flops and, oh, we need to mask up. And I went, whoa, 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 we don't just mask up. That is not only illegal and it violates our civil liberties, right? It is incredibly dangerous and unsafe and unhealthy. And that's when I started speaking up, and that's how Kristen and I met.
Well, also, within my career field, I used to work in hospitals, and I've sat on numerous infectious disease boards. And what I did is I sat and educated nurses, doctors, surgeons on how to deal with flu outbreaks, the SARS outbreak. So I knew, yes, there's something called the hierarchy of safety and controls. We have the engineering standards, there's work practices that you change. PPE is a last resort. But when you're dealing with infectious disease patients, these are not the masks that you wear. Even N95s are not fully rated to protect against a virus. These micron sizes, again, they're not rated by the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health. They're not approved for this use, so not only is this a bad idea, there's numerous studies for years based off of the flu outbreaks across the world several years ago that not only do these ear loop masks and cloth masks not work, they are increasing the spread through fomite transmission, which is a form of cross-contamination.
Okay, as you can see, what more proof do we need? Here's right from the experts, from OSHA experts. And by the way, fascinating interview. If you want to watch it, it's about 30, 40 minutes long, but it's coming straight from those people who are responsible for this certification of hospitals, workers, etc., etc., etc. Very fascinating, very insightful. So at least that's the way I found it. A great job for Del Bigtree that he actually exposed this whole fraud once again and called it for what it is, with a solid scientific foundation. So that brings me to Judges 10:14. Go and cry out to the gods whom you have chosen. Let them save you in the time of your distress. And that's exactly the way I see masks, a sign of idolatry and sign of submission, a sign of slavery, the symbol for everything, all this anti-scientific, populist, satanic fraud and agenda that we are dealing with, okay? And again, the authors of the book say, in fact, there is no study to even suggest that it makes any sense for healthy individuals to wear masks in public. One might suspect that the only political reason for forcing the measure is to foster fear in the population. And interestingly enough, that same theme emerges over and over and over again anywhere I look. It almost seems that all these measures are instituted to promote fear, paranoia, dependency, and all these other evil, negative things in the population, and especially the most vulnerable part of the population. The next part, what about all these horror stories? I'm pretty sure you've heard quite a few of those. Like, I usually listen like to my coworkers, to my relatives, and sometimes in different countries. There's always these horror stories about, oh, so such and such, they were just drowning in the fluids and all of this. And of course, look, the medical condition is not fun, and there's a respiratory condition is not, it's not an easy ride to die from. But look at what these authors uncovered here. It came to light in May when a previously confidential document appeared on the website of the German Ministry of the Interior. There, one was astounded to learn that fear-mongering was the official agenda created to manage the epidemic. Everything had been planned. The high numbers of infection were purposely reported because the numbers of deaths would sound too trivial. And then notice, 3 examples are given how to stir up primal fears in the general population. Number 1, people should be scared by a detailed description of dying from COVID-19 as slow drowning. I heard myself from some of the people that I know who kept on saying this story, and they kept referring, that's why we should be masked, it's so horrible, it's so bad. Imagining death through excruciating slow suffocation incites the most dread. Okay? The number 2, people should be told that children were a dangerous source of infection because they would unwittingly carry the deadly virus and kill their parents. Okay, there goes the Sasquatch again, over and over and over again. Warnings about alarming rate consequences of infections were to be scattered, even though not formally proven to exist. In other words, it's a myth, brothers and sisters. It never actually happened. They would frighten people. Okay, so understand how these people think. They say, oh, we have this pandemic, epidemic, whatever you call it. Let's put all this fear into the people so this way they'll stay home, and maybe this way we will not be able to spread more of the infection. But understand, this is all fear-driven propaganda, which is what I've been saying all along. And that brings me to Psalm 52:2. Your tongue plots destruction like a sharp razor, you worker of deceit. And that's what I'm saying to all these people in charge, entrusted with the destinies of cities, counties, states, nations, and the whole world. You workers of deceit. You see, there's a lot of condemnation that's going on, and I'm sorry, brothers and sisters, but this is just the reality that we are dealing with. This is the evil at its prime, when people that might even believe that they have best intentions in their hearts, becoming either witting or unwitting promoters of all the evil, death, and suffering. But let me move on. The unintended consequences are just horrendous. I mean, if you just look at the drugs and suicide, and the authors cite a number of different things, like, for instance, Australian government estimates a rise in suicides of 50% as the result of lockdowns and the resulting economic hardship. A number 10 times higher than the number of coronavirus deaths, okay? So, I mean, think about it. In other words, many more people are going to die as the result of the false cure than the disease itself. Now you have heart attack and stroke. Unemployment increases the risk of heart attacks, etc., etc. Loneliness and isolation. People get lonely, people get depressed. There's domestic violence, child abuse, alcoholism, drug use, mental illnesses. I kept talking about it for all these weeks and months, and again, this is just yet another independent confirmation. And let me not even get started on the impact of children, that children actually need social contacts. Do you know that our brain, in order to this 15 years of our development after the moment of birth, when the brain is being configured and filled in with information, that's the way God designed us, okay? If we put children into these sterile environments surrounded by masked people, then you can only imagine the irreparable damage that it can do to a child's mind. And there's also innocent and vulnerable. There's all these statistics that you can look at in the book as well as in all these other sources. But I'll move on here and continue with the nursing homes. And it seems to me that it's one of the darkest legacies of this whole situation with the Sasquatch will be the tragedy that happened in the nursing homes. Now, according to the authors, and you can also cross-reference it with other sources, in Western countries, basically 30 to 60% of coronavirus victims died in care facilities and retirement homes. So approximately half of all of these deaths that you can see, regardless how they're counted, come from the nursing homes. And here's I found a very, touchy description of what actually happens in the nursing homes. Because these authors, they've been involved with terminal care. And here's what they pointed out. When we hear talk about the older people, and we are told that it is our moral duty to protect them, right? You see a lot of these, self-righteous people on the streets pointing fingers at me, say, oh, you don't care about elderly people. Oh, you will infect them, etc., etc. Okay, so our moral duty is to protect them. But many pictures sprightly seniors who are enjoying their time on ocean liners. In reality, and here is the ultimate cold reality check, the endangered elderly are multi-morbid individuals in the end of their lives. Amidst all of the protective measures for the high-risk groups in retirement and nursing homes, at the end, the individual decision should have the highest priority. Most no longer care whether their loved ones bring the coronavirus to them. As long as someone is there to hold their hand, to talk about the past, and to whisper, I love you, and the farewell. Brothers and sisters, my heart breaks down because those are people who were terminally ill. They already knew they had very little time. All they wanted is this final release, to say the final goodbye, to see the faces of the loved ones, and to move on with their journey. And they were robbed of that. And those people who did it with all these Pharisaic self-righteousness claims, they gonna answer for that, because this is the crime against human dignity. This is something for which we should have another trial, of a Nuremberg-style trial out there. And these are the practices that must be banned once and for all by international codes. And that reminds me of Isaiah 29:20. For the ruthless shall come to nothing, and the scoffer cease, and all who watch to do evil shall be cut off. All these people who did this great evil will be cut off, will have to face their maker for what they have done. And that again brings me to the ultimate role of the government. What did the government do right? Nothing. I can't find anything that they did right. But what did they do wrong? They proclaimed an epidemic of national concern that did not exist, okay? And that's just the brutal truth. It deprived citizens of their rights. We've been on a lockdown, we've been forced to wear masks, we've been not allowed to travel, and all these other things. Some people lost their jobs, lost their dignity, lost their chance to say goodbye to the loved ones. It made arbitrary instead of evidence-based decisions. None of these decisions were scientific. They were either populistic or blatantly arbitrary. It intentionally spread fear, and you saw the documents that were cited in the book and all these other things. It enforced senseless lockdown and mask wearing. It devastated the economy and destroyed livelihoods. It disrupted the healthcare system. It inflicted immense suffering on the populace. These are not my words. These are the authors of the book, PhDs in infectious diseases and all of these areas of expertise that are far and beyond what I can say. But to me, it's like the ultimate authority. They know what they're doing, and I praise God that there are some brave souls out there who are willing to stake their lives and careers to expose all these lies. You know, 1 Samuel 8:7 and 18 says, "And the Lord said to Samuel, obey the voice of the people in all that it say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them." That's when basically Israelites came to Samuel and say, we don't need God to rule over us. We don't want a theocracy. Give us the king, just like all the other nations there. And then notice what then the Lord continues. "And in that day you will cry out because of your king, whom you have chosen for yourselves, but the Lord will not answer you in that day." Brothers and sisters, we chose our own government, and if we do not wake up and stand up to them, there's only a few weeks left for the next particular cycle of renewal, so to say. If we do not wake up, then God save us all. This is the type of scenario that we are dealing with, and this cuts right through the core of this particular situation here. But let me move on and continue with media crimes. You see, traditionally, mass media has always supposed to be the watchdogs of the bad government. They're supposed to be the fourth branch of the government that is essentially making sure that the government doesn't get out of control. And what do we have here? What we have here is basically that there's still, unfortunately, a lot of people who think that things must be true when they are reported by the public broadcasters. And then the Susan Wojcicki, CEO of YouTube, said during a recent interview, "Everything that violates the recommendations of the World Health Organization would constitute a breach against our guidelines. Therefore, deletion is another important part of our guidelines. The WHO, that was responsible for the fake swine flu pandemic in 2009, this is author's comments, right? The WHO that overestimated the COVID-19 mortality on a large scale and drove the world into a crisis with this and other misjudgments." And this becomes the ultimate authority that the CEO of YouTube cites as the ultimate justification for censoring and quenching of all of the scientific legitimate debate. Brothers and sisters, we have reached a very sorry state of affairs in this blessed land when we allow some bureaucrats outside of the United States to dictate what the scientific policy and scientific discussion is supposed to be. So is that any wonder that English Professor John Oxford, one of the best-known virologists worldwide, actually said, "Personally, I would say the best advice is to spend less time watching TV news, which is sensational and not very good. Personally, I view this COVID outbreak as akin to a bad winter influenza epidemic." There we go again, right? That's where we started here today. We are suffering from a media epidemic. You see, the media are responsible for all of these crimes against humanity. And I can tell you, back at the Nuremberg trial, the media were also tried together with other Nazis, and some of them were hung for crimes against humanity for enforcing all that fear and paranoia and everything. Proverbs 19:9 says, "A false witness will not go unpunished, and he who breathes out lies will perish." And I can tell you, false media will not go unpunished. Time will come when you'll either go into nothingness or will be dismantled and extinguished. And even if people don't wake up, and even if we go through deeper cycles of darkness, eventually you're going to face your maker, and justice will be served for everything that you have done. And that brings me to the final part of the book, where the authors say, okay, what do we do moving forward? And there is a lot of talking out there about the vaccines. Vaccine that, oh, we'll not get back to normal until the vaccine becomes available, and so on and so forth. Well, first of all, what these experts point out, that there's two different types of immunity. There is the antibody-induced immunity. That's what vaccines are targeting. So the idea, in theory, is you're injected with some garbage, and some of it is related to the viral particles that provokes your immune system into this frantic activity, and the antibodies are produced, and you develop some kind of memory so you can fight these viral particles later. But there is not just one system in our immunity. There is the second one, the defense strategy number 2, and it operates in a very different way. It has its own memory, but it cannot be triggered by these bogus ideas like vaccinations, etc. And it turns out that vaccination ignores our main lines of defense. Just look at what these experts are saying. So even if vaccination is successful, meaning that production of protective antibodies has taken place, it does not guarantee immunity. So where's all this false idolatrous belief comes from, that somehow we're going to have the magic injection that's going to protect us against this common cold variety virus? Then to worsen matters, antibody production spontaneously wanes after just a few months. In other words, that protection, even if there were any protection, is only going to last a few months. Protection, if any at all, is at best short-lived. So that's your best hope, is you'll get a short-lived protection. Again, it's not my opinion. That comes straight from the experts. Now, the second arm, though, of our immune system is seldom talked about. This is what we call innate immunity. That's the immunity that is basically the general defensive mechanism of our bodies. But it is probably actually all important, much more so than the antibodies that represent a rather shaky first line of defense. You know what? That reminds me of Psalm 139:14. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works. My soul knows it very well. You know, the top immunologists say they don't really understand exactly how the immune system works. We are trying to monkey around and fine-tune one of the most fearfully and wonderfully made systems, that is our God-given bodies. Okay, so anyone who thinks that somehow we are smarter than God, it can fool our bodies into all these defenses, I urge you to reconsider and do your own research. This is super, super important. The authors continue. There's been a lot of talk about global vaccination effort. But does it make sense when they say, well, when is it called for? When an infection regularly leads to severe illness and or serious sequels in healthy individuals. And this is not the case with SARS-CoV-2. In other words, the severity of this disease does not justify even talking about world-scale vaccination the way it's promoted by Bill Gates, etc. When would mass vaccination not be reasonable? I say, well, it's a large part of the population is already sufficiently protected against a life-threatening disease. Now, when will vaccination likely be unsuccessful? And I say the vaccination will fail when the virus coexisting worldwide with man and animals continuously undergoes mutational change. And look at the grand conclusions. In the author's view, a global vaccination program makes no sense. The risks far outweigh any possible benefit right from the start. And that's the very important conclusion. And I would say, that brings me to 2 Peter 2:3. And in their greed, they will exploit you with false words. Their condemnation from long ago is not idle, and their destruction is not asleep. Okay? Don't be fools. Don't be misled by the greed of others who want to use you and abuse you and bring all of these unintended consequences on the altar of greater good. And then if you still don't believe me or don't believe these authors or don't do your other research, notice what the authors say about experimental vaccines. And that's the situation that we're in. We are talking about experimental vaccine that they are about to unleash on these multiple populations. So the authors describe a whole bunch of different techniques, in particular this thing called the gene-based vaccines. And notice how they say that attempts have been made to create replication-competent vaccines. So this is this new experimental technology. This was undertaken with the Ebola vaccine. However, viral multiplication, listen carefully, caused severe side effects in at least 20% of the vaccinated, including rash, vasculitis, dermatitis, and arthralgia. I mean, I can tell you, these are not pleasant kind of temporary side effects, and they took place, they were observed in 20% of the vaccinated. Okay? Now, then there's also gene-based vaccine, such as mRNA. That's exactly the Moderna research that they are trying to advance in this Operation Warp Speed. Now, that's basically said a great potential danger of DNA-based vaccines is the integration of plasmid DNA into the cell genome, and it can become a realistic danger when the number of events is very large, as in the mass vaccination of a population. If insertion occurs in cells of the reproductive system, the altered genetic information will be transmitted from mother to a child. In other words, the moment you receive that injection, it's over, not just for you, but for the entire offspring, because the genetic code itself has been altered at this point with unpredictable consequences. And then they say other dangers of DNA vaccines are production of anti-DNA antibodies and autoimmune reactions. Safety concerns linked to mRNA vaccines include systemic inflammation and potential toxic effects. So you know, this is not just a mild headache or a little type of, being down in the mood. This is some really serious stuff. And they basically conclude, the authors, that it is inevitable that autoimmune attacks will be mounted against the cells. Where, when, and with which effects this might occur is entirely unknown, but the prospects are simply terrifying. So again, and I've cross-referenced it with other sources, experimental vaccines are extremely dangerous, contrary to what everyone else is saying there, and the prospects of their use at mass are terrifying. And that is not coming from me, it's coming from the experts. And that brings me to Hosea 11:2. The more they were called, the more they went away. They kept sacrificing to the Baals and burning offerings to idols. And I just amazed how these human sacrifices are continuing over and over and over again. I published a whole video about it a month ago. But it seems to me that this is a never-ending story. There is this built-in drive among many people towards this idolatry and sacrificing for the better good. Okay. And if you're not convinced yet, it already happened before, and the authors point out this happened with the swine flu vaccine fiasco. Okay, it's almost forgotten today as that one adjuvanted swine flu vaccine caused side effects that ruined thousands of lives. We're talking about thousands of lives, so it's a pretty sizable chunk. The side effects were caused because antibodies against the virus cross-reacted with the target in the brains of the victims. Not in the arm, not in the leg, in the brain, okay? The damage was the result of a classic antibody-driven autoimmune disease. So in other words, they aggravate your immune system to the point that it goes berserk. Your immune system gets so aggravated as a result of that junk injection in your arm or leg or whatever, that it literally starts consuming and destroying its whole body. Because remember, the immune system is one of the most sophisticated God-given system of defense that I would never, ever want to monkey around with all of these idolatrous artificial techniques. The side effect was relatively rare. The incidence was probably something in the order of 1 in 10,000, but the outcome was tragic because so many millions received the vaccine, okay, essentially for nothing, since the infection generally ran a mild course. Same thing as basically happening in this situation. In retrospect, the risk-benefit ratio of swine flu vaccination must be admitted to have been disastrous. This is what happens when mass vaccination is undertaken without need. And I can tell you, 1 in 10,000 is either dead or brain dead. That means 10 in 100,000. That means 100 in a million. That means 1,000 in 10 million. That means 10,000 in 100 million. That means up to 30,000 dead or whatever. There's severe suffering individuals if the entire population of the United States is vaccinated. Is it worth it for something that has, according to official data, 0.02% risk of causing death at large? Okay, see, the whole thing is ridiculous. The more I study, the more I try to understand. It's just mind-boggling. And this has already happened before. So see, Psalm 9:17 tells, "The wicked shall return to Sheol, all the nations that forget God." All right, this is what happens. We're literally driving ourselves into Sheol, and especially if we unleash and allow mass vaccination campaign, I don't even know what might happen and the type of damage that so many people might suffer through. Okay, that brings me to the final couple of slides here. Why? Well, authors conclude the book by saying, look, one of the last German politicians once said, "The stupidity of governments should never be underestimated." And I agree with that. Governments do a lot of stupid things. And in my life, all my life, I had to fight with the governments. There's as yet any clear case when the government actually helped me. Okay? And this time it was only a virus that knocked on our door, not even a lethal virus, just some real threat. But look at what we had to go through as a consequence. Mass hysteria fueled by media, arbitrary political decisions, massive restrictions on fundamental rights, censorship, freedom of expression. I'm not even sure how long this video will stay on YouTube, but it's okay. Look, it's about the truth. It's not about them. They're going to face the judgment. If not in this world, then in the next. And sooner or later, the reckoning will come. Enforced conformity of the media, defamation of dissidents, like people like, all these ones that have been censored, put under death threats, or somehow suppressed in other ways, denunciation, dangerous human experiments. That's already happening, and that's coming even more if we don't wake up and agree to all of this. So as you can see, stupidity of politicians, desire to act no matter what. Some politicians were so stupid that they just wanted to act to create an impression that they're doing something for the people, etc., etc., etc. And Proverbs 18:7 shows me, "A fool's mouth is his ruin, and his lips are a snare to his soul." And again, I put a lot of these biblical references because as I was working on these slides, still under the impression of the book, that God kept kind of, inspiring me. Okay, look at this, look at this, look at this, look at this. Because now you can see how when you look at the Bible, you can actually, and when you learn the scripture, all these different parts come to you and highlight all the individual practical situation. And the authors end their book with this. But in my view, it's still somewhat incomplete. Why? Because despite all these answers to the why question, we need to know the real reason, right? And this is where we enter into the area of worldviews. If you don't believe in God, if you just believe in the society and the goodness of the humanity, you will have a really hard time thinking about why. Now, if some people find refuge in conspiracy theories, they imagine people sitting out there somewhere in the round table and scheming and planning all of this world domination, control, in almost a caricature style. But the reality is that at the foundational level, it can all be explained as a conspiracy theory, but that is not caricatured to this point of some kind of secret society out there. And you know what? The Christian worldview is the ultimate conspiracy theory, because according to the Bible, the explanation is actually given to you at many different levels. And let me read just two quotes from the Bible. The number one is from John 8:44. And that's when Jesus talks to the Pharisees, to the religious authorities of the time, about 2,000 years ago. You are of your father the devil, and your will is to do your father's desires, the devil's desires, right? He was a murderer from the beginning and does not stand in the truth, because there is no truth in him. No truth, right? When he lies, he speaks out of his own character, for he is a liar and the father of lies. Brothers and sisters, this is the ultimate explanation of why we see what we see. This is the result of the world being influenced by the father of lies, who is a liar and the father of all lies, okay, the devil himself. And it doesn't matter whether there's some group of people somewhere in the remote corner of the world sitting at the round table plotting and scheming. It doesn't matter whether they have real control or not. In the end, all these lines lead to the ultimate liar and the father of all lies, okay? And that's very important, because that's the ultimate explanation. So what is the solution? The good news is that the Bible gives us the ultimate solution to this too. So it's not leaving us suspended in the air out there. And again, in the Gospel of John, chapter 14, there's this beautiful opening segment. When Jesus speaks to his disciples in the Last Supper, so basically his final communion before all the passion and the crucifixion and the trial and everything. And this is what Jesus tells them, to his disciples, and through them to all of us. Let not your hearts be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many rooms. Jesus talks about the future kingdom, the kingdom of heaven. In my Father's house are many rooms. If it were not so, would I have told you that I go to prepare a place for you? And not just for them, but for you and me, all of those who are born again Christians, right? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and will take you to myself. Now he talks about the second coming, the future kingdom. That where I am, you may be also. So it's basically Jesus is saying, don't worry that I'm going away. I have a place to prepare for you, and I'm coming back to pick you up. And you know the way to where I'm going. And then Thomas said to him, Thomas is the one who was famous doubter, right? The doubting Thomas. Lord, we do not know where you're going. How can we know the way? Okay, that's a typical human-based question that a lot of people are trying to ask. And then Jesus said to him, and listen carefully here, and Jesus said, I am the way and the truth and the life, and no one comes to the Father except through me. Think how profound these words are. Let your hearts not be troubled. Which side are you on? Are you on the side of the father, the devil, the liar, and the father of all lies, like all these politicians and world controllers and health commissioners and all these people who consciously or subconsciously are scheming and trying to make our lives miserable under the pretense for the greater good of all, and doing all of these horrible practices that are causing nothing but pain and suffering? Or are you willing to surrender your life to Jesus and walk with him? Why? Because he is our ultimate Father, and he is the way and the truth and the life, and no one can come to the Father except through him. So think about it. Join the kingdom. This is the best news ever. That's why I call it the gospel of Jesus Christ. And don't be fooled into thinking that there are many ways to God. It's yet another lie invented by the devil to keep you from entering the kingdom. Jesus said, I am the way and the truth and the life. And no one comes to the Father except through me. And this is a very somber warning to those who are obtuse, but it's a very, very promising and happy news to all of those who realize that this is indeed the case. So which side are you on? On the side of the father of all lies, or on the side of Jesus? So think about it. Repent of your old ways. Surrender your life to him. Walk with him, wherever it leads you, and the peace of God that surpasses all understanding will come to you. That's all I wanted to say, and I'll see you on the other side. Amen.